What if I told you that a single company once had the power to mint its own currency, command armies larger than most nations, and effectively rule over a fifth of humanity? Not a government, not an empire, a company, a corporation driven by profit that became so powerful it literally conquered countries, started wars, and made kings bow to its demands. This is the story of the British East India Company, the most powerful corporation that ever existed, and how a group of merchants became richer and more influential than entire nations. London, December 31st, 1600. Queen Elizabeth I signed a royal charter granting a small group of merchants exclusive rights to trade with the East Indies. On paper, it seemed simple enough. A few ambitious businessmen wanted to import spices, silk, and tea from Asia. The charter gave them a monopoly for 15 years. Nobody could have imagined that this single piece of paper would set in motion events that would reshape the entire world. The company started with just 125 shareholders and a modest capital investment. Their goal was straightforward: sail to the distant lands of the East, buy exotic goods, bring them back to Europe, and sell them at a massive profit. Spices were worth their weight in gold back then. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves. These weren't just ingredients for cooking. They were status symbols, preservatives, medicines. And Europe was obsessed with them. But there was a problem. The Dutch and the Portuguese had already established themselves in the spice trade. They controlled key ports and had no intention of sharing. The East India Company needed to be ruthless from the very beginning. Their first voyages were dangerous, expensive, and uncertain. Ships took years to complete a single journey. Many never returned. But the profits from successful voyages were astronomical. A single shipment could generate returns of several 100%. Investors were hooked. The company grew rapidly, building a fleet of armed merchant vessels. And here's where things get interesting. These weren't just cargo ships. They were floating fortresses equipped with cannons and soldiers. Because in the world of 17th century trade, business and warfare were inseparable. The company established its first trading post in India in 1608, in the port city of Surat. The Mughal Empire, which ruled most of the Indian subcontinent, was at its peak. Emperor Jahangir controlled vast wealth and commanded millions of subjects. The East India Company representatives had to negotiate carefully. They needed permission to trade, and they got it by offering gifts, paying tributes, and making themselves useful. But they were always watching, always calculating, always looking for opportunities to expand their influence. Over the next few decades, the company established more trading posts along the Indian coast. Madras, Bombay, Calcutta. These weren't just warehouses. They were fortified settlements with their own governments, courts, and military forces. The company was building its own empire within an empire, and the Mughal rulers didn't fully realize what was happening until it was too late. By the late 17th century, the East India Company had transformed from a simple trading operation into something far more complex and dangerous. They had their own private army. They negotiated treaties with local rulers as if they were a sovereign nation. They collected taxes. They administered justice. And all of this was done in the name of profit. Shareholders in London watched their investments multiply while company officials in India became fabulously wealthy. But the real turning point came in 1757 at a place called Plassey in Bengal. This is where the East India Company stopped pretending to be just a business and revealed itself as a conquering force. Bengal was one of the richest regions in India, perhaps in the entire world. Its textile industry was legendary. Its agriculture was abundant. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Daulah, was young and suspicious of the growing power of the British traders. He had good reason to be. The East India Company had been fortifying Calcutta without his permission, essentially preparing for war. When he demanded they stop, they refused. So he attacked. His forces captured Calcutta in 1756. The British were humiliated, and they wanted revenge. Robert Clive, a company official who had risen from clerk to military commander, was sent to retake the city. What happened next would change the course of history. Clive didn't just want to recapture Calcutta. He wanted to overthrow the Nawab entirely. So he did what the East India Company did best. He made deals. He bribed military commanders in the Nawab's army. He promised wealth and power to anyone who would betray their ruler. And it worked. At the Battle of Plassey, the Nawab's forces vastly outnumbered the British. On paper, it should have been a massacre, but most of the Nawab commanders had already been bought. They stood idle while Clive's forces attacked. The battle was over in hours. The Nawab fled and was later captured and executed. Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions on earth, had just fallen to a corporation. The East India Company installed a puppet Nawab who owed everything to them. In return, they received the right to collect taxes across Bengal. Let that sink in. A private company now had the authority to tax millions of people. The revenue was staggering. Within a few years, the company was extracting tens of millions of pounds from Bengal alone. This wasn't trade anymore. This was tribute. This was colonization disguised as commerce. And the shareholders in London were ecstatic. Dividends soared. Stock prices skyrocketed. The East India Company was now one of the most valuable enterprises in the world. But there was a dark side to this success, and it was brutal. The company's rule over Bengal was catastrophic for the local population. They squeezed every possible penny from the land. Tax collectors were merciless. Farmers were forced to sell their crops at fixed prices, far below market value. The company manipulated trade to maximize its own profits while local industries collapsed. And then came the famine. Between 1769 and 1773, a devastating famine swept through Bengal. Millions died. Some estimates suggest that a third of the population perished. And what did the East India Company do? They continued collecting taxes. Even as people starved in the streets, the company extracted its revenue. They prioritized profit over human life, and the consequences were unspeakable. Back in Britain, news of the famine caused outrage. The East India Company was supposed to be a trading enterprise, not a government, but it had become something monstrous, a hybrid entity that wielded the power of a state with the ruthlessness of a business. Parliament began to ask difficult questions. How could a private company be allowed to rule over millions of people? How could it command armies and collect taxes without any accountability? The answer was simple: money. The company was too rich, too powerful, too connected. Its directors had influence in Parliament. Its wealth propped up the British economy. And so, despite the outrage, the company continued. The East India Company had become an unstoppable machine, and it was hungry for more. By the late 18th century, it controlled vast territories across India, but control came with complications. Running an empire was expensive. Wars were constant. Administration required thousands of employees. Corruption was rampant. Company officials were supposed to be merchants, but they had become lords, living in luxury while extracting fortune from the land. Many returned to Britain as wealthy as aristocrats, building grand estates and buying their way into high society. They were called nabobs, a term dripping with both envy and contempt. These men had gone to India as clerks and come back as millionaires, and their wealth was impossible to ignore. But the company itself was in trouble. Despite controlling some of the richest territories on earth, it was drowning in debt. Military campaigns were costly. The administrative apparatus was bloated and corrupt. Officials were lining their own pockets while the company's finances deteriorated. By 1773, the East India Company was on the verge of bankruptcy. It went to the British government, hat in hand, asking for a bailout. Think about that for a moment. A corporation that ruled over tens of millions of people, that collected more tax revenue than many European nations, was broke, and the British government had to step in to save it. Parliament passed the Regulating Act of 1773, which gave the government more oversight over the company's activities. It was the beginning of the end of the company's independence, but it would take another century for that end to fully arrive. The company limped forward, still powerful but now under increasing scrutiny. It continued to expand, annexing more territories through a combination of military force and cunning diplomacy. The doctrine of lapse became one of its favorite tools. If an Indian ruler died without a male heir, the company would simply annex his territory, claiming it had lapsed back to them. It was legal theft, dressed up in bureaucratic language. Entire kingdoms disappeared this way. The company also provoked wars whenever it suited their interests. They fought against the Marathas, the Mysore Sultanate, the Sikhs. Each war expanded their territory, but also drained their resources. The company was trapped in a cycle of conquest and financial crisis, always needing more land to pay for the cost of the land they had already taken. Meanwhile, the opium trade became one of the company's most profitable and morally reprehensible ventures. China had something Britain desperately wanted: tea. By the 19th century, tea had become a British obsession. Everyone drank it, from the poorest labour to the Queen herself. But China would only accept silver in payment, and Britain was running out of silver. The trade imbalance was unsustainable. So the East India Company came up with a solution. They would grow opium in India and smuggle it into China. The Chinese government had banned opium because they understood its devastating effects, but the company didn't care. Profit was the only thing that mattered. They flooded China with opium, creating millions of addicts and draining silver back out of the Chinese economy. When the Chinese government tried to stop the trade by seizing and destroying opium shipments, Britain went to war to defend the company's right to sell drugs. The First Opium War resulted in a humiliating defeat for China and the cession of Hong Kong to Britain. The East India Company had just forced an entire nation to accept its poison at gunpoint. Back in India, resentment against the company was building. For a century, the company had been tightening its grip, and the pressure was becoming unbearable. Traditional rulers had been stripped of their power. The company interfered in religious and cultural practices. They imposed new taxes and legal systems that seemed designed to humiliate and exploit. Indian soldiers, called sepoys, made up the vast majority of the company's army, but they were paid less than British soldiers and treated as inferior. The company assumed that loyalty could be bought, that fear would keep people in line. They were catastrophically wrong. In 1857, rebellion erupted. It started with the sepoys, triggered by rumors that new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. But the uprising quickly spread beyond the army. It became a mass revolt against company rule. Ordinary people, dispossessed nobles, and former rulers joined the fight. For over a year, India burned. The rebellion was brutal on both sides. Massacres, reprisals, atrocities that are hard to even describe. The company's response was savage. Entire villages were destroyed. Rebels were executed in horrific ways, sometimes blown apart by cannons as a warning to others. The British eventually crushed the uprising, but the cost was enormous, both in lives and in the company's remaining credibility. The rebellion of 1857 marked the end of the East India Company as a ruling power. The British government had finally seen enough. A corporation, no matter how powerful, could not be trusted to govern an empire. In 1858, the British Crown took direct control of India. The East India Company was stripped of its administrative and military functions. It continued to exist for a few more years as a trading entity, a shadow of its former self, managing tea and other commodities. But the great experiment was over. The company that had ruled over more people than the Roman Empire at its height, that had commanded armies and toppled kingdoms, was dissolved in 1874. Its assets were absorbed by the British government, its legacy absorbed into the British Empire. So what do we make of the East India Company? It's tempting to see it as just a historical curiosity, a bizarre aberration that could never happen again. But that would be a mistake. The East India Company showed us what happens when a corporation is allowed to accumulate power without accountability. It demonstrated that the pursuit of profit, when unchecked, can lead to catastrophic human suffering. It proved that businesses, given the opportunity, will behave like empires. The company started as a group of merchants looking to make money from spices, and it ended as a colonial power responsible for famines, wars, and the subjugation of millions. And it did all of this in the name of shareholders, dividends, and maximizing returns. The mechanisms the company used, monopoly power, political influence, military force, economic manipulation, these didn't disappear when the company was dissolved. They evolved. Today, we don't have corporations minting their own currency or commanding private armies, at least not openly. But we do have corporations with budgets larger than most nations, with the ability to shape laws and influence governments, with control over resources that affect billions of lives. The scale is different, the methods are more sophisticated, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Power concentrates, and without checks, it corrupts. The story of the East India Company forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, accountability, and the nature of corporations themselves. When the company was finally dissolved, many in Britain breathed a sigh of relief. The embarrassment was over. The scandals, the famines, the brutal suppression of the uprising, all of it could be blamed on a rogue corporation that had overstepped its bounds. The British government could now present itself as a responsible authority, bringing order and civilization to India. But this narrative was convenient fiction. The East India Company didn't operate in a vacuum. It existed because the British government allowed it to exist. It grew powerful because Parliament granted it monopolies and legal protections. It conquered territories because the Crown backed its claims. Every atrocity committed by the company was enabled by a system that prioritized profit and empire over human dignity. What made the East India Company so dangerous wasn't just its size or wealth. It was the way it blurred the lines between commerce and governance, between private interest and public authority. The company had shareholders to answer to, not citizens. Its primary obligation was to generate returns, not to provide justice or promote welfare. And yet it wielded all the powers of a state, the ability to tax, to wage war, to imprison, to execute. This created a fundamentally unstable and unjust system. Decisions that affected millions of lives were made in boardrooms in London by men who had never set foot in India and never would. The people who suffered under company rule had no voice, no representation, no recourse. They were simply resources to be exploited for maximum profit. The legacy of the East India Company extends far beyond its formal dissolution. It shaped the modern world in profound ways. The company's activities laid the groundwork for the British Empire's dominance in the 19th century. The wealth extracted from India fueled Britain's Industrial Revolution. Cotton, textiles, opium, tea. These commodities didn't just enrich individual merchants. They financed factories, railways, and technological innovations that transformed Britain into the world's leading industrial power. Meanwhile, India, which had been one of the wealthiest regions on Earth, was systematically deindustrialized. The company destroyed local industries to create captive markets for British goods. Weavers who had produced the finest textiles in the world found themselves unable to compete with cheap British imports. The economic relationship was deliberately designed to benefit Britain at India's expense, and the effects lasted for generations. The company also pioneered corporate structures and practices that we still see today. It was one of the first joint stock companies, allowing investors to buy and sell shares and spread risk across a large pool of capital. This innovation made it possible to finance massive, long-term ventures that no single individual could afford. It was a brilliant financial mechanism, but it also created a dangerous separation between ownership and accountability. Shareholders could profit from a company's activities without having to witness or take responsibility for the consequences. They received their dividends without seeing the famines, the wars, the exploitation. This distance between profit and consequence is still a defining feature of modern corporations. The East India Company's story also reveals how corporations can capture governments and bend them to their will. The company spent enormous sums on lobbying, bribes, and political influence. Company directors sat in Parliament. Former company officials filled positions of power throughout the British government. When the company needed favorable legislation, it usually got it. When it needed military support, the Royal Navy was often available. The relationship between the company and the state was supposed to be one of oversight and regulation, but in practice it was often one of collusion and mutual benefit. The company's interest became conflated with national interests, making it nearly impossible to challenge a company without being accused of betraying Britain itself. This pattern of corporate influence over government didn't end with the East India Company. We see echoes of it throughout history and into the present day. Corporations lobby for favorable laws, fund political campaigns, employ former government officials, and shape policy in ways that serve their interests. The mechanisms are more subtle now, more legally sophisticated, but the fundamental dynamic is the same. When corporations become powerful enough, they don't just operate within the rules, they write the rules. And this is where the lessons of the East India Company become urgent and relevant. We like to think we've moved beyond the era of corporate empires, that modern regulations and democratic institutions provide sufficient safeguards. But have we really? Consider the power wielded by today's largest corporations. Tech companies control the flow of information for billions of people. They shape public discourse, influence elections, and collect data on a scale that would make the East India Company's intelligence networks look primitive. Financial institutions are deemed too big to fail, meaning their reckless behavior can hold entire economies hostage. Pharmaceutical companies set prices for life-saving medicines based on profit maximization rather than public health needs. Energy corporations have spent decades funding misinformation campaigns to protect their business models, even as a climate crisis threatens humanity's future. These aren't fringe actors. These are some of the most respected and powerful entities in the world, and they operate with a level of influence that should concern anyone who remembers what happened when the East India Company accumulated unchecked power. The defenders of corporate power often argue that modern corporations are fundamentally different from the East India Company. They don't have private armies. They don't collect taxes. They operate in competitive markets with regulatory oversight. And these points have some validity. But they miss the deeper issue. The East India Company didn't start with an army. It didn't begin by overthrowing governments. It started as a trading enterprise that gradually accumulated power because the systems meant to constrain it were weak, corrupted, or complicit. The transformation was incremental, each step seemingly reasonable in isolation, until suddenly a corporation had become more powerful than nations. We should ask ourselves whether we're witnessing a similar process today, just moving at a different pace and taking different forms. The East India Company also teaches us about the human capacity for rationalization and moral blindness. The men who ran the company weren't monsters, at least not in their own minds. They saw themselves as civilizing forces, bringing order and commerce to distant lands. They genuinely believed they were acting in Britain's interests and even, in some twisted way, in the interests of the people they ruled. This ability to justify exploitation, to dress up greed in the language of progress and duty, is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the company's history. It reminds us that terrible things are often done by people who believe they are doing good, or at least doing what's necessary. And it warns us to be skeptical of grand narratives that justify the concentration of power and wealth, no matter how compelling they sound. So where does this leave us? The East India Company is gone, but the questions it raises are still with us. How much power should corporations be allowed to have? What obligations do they owe to society beyond maximizing shareholder value? How do we ensure accountability when decisions made in boardrooms affect the lives of millions? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They are urgent practical challenges that will shape the future of human civilization. The East India Company showed us what happens when we get the answers wrong. It demonstrated that unchecked corporate power can lead to exploitation, violence, and suffering on a massive scale. We ignore those lessons at our peril. The company that started with a simple charter to trade spices became a force that conquered nations, destroyed economies, and caused immeasurable human suffering, all in the name of profit. It was finally brought down not by moral awakening or popular uprising alone, but by its own unsustainable excesses and the political calculations of a government that realized the arrangement had become too embarrassing and unstable to continue. The story is a warning, a reminder that power always seeks to expand, that profit divorced from accountability is dangerous, and that the systems we create to organize economic activity have profound moral and political consequences. If you found this story eye-opening, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into history's most fascinating and disturbing stories. And drop a comment below. Do you see parallels between the East India Company and modern corporations? Are we repeating the mistakes of the past, or have we learned enough to avoid them? Let's talk about it. Because understanding where we've been is the only way to make better choices about where we're going. The East India Company may be dead, but its ghost still haunts us, whispering questions we'd rather not answer about power, greed, and the true cause of unchecked ambition.